3 common New Zealand Christmas items that you will not see in the US. Okay, number 1, Christmas mince pies. It took me a while to try these because I was confused by the word mince. It's not meat, it's actually minced up fruit, and you do not see these in the US, but they are fantastic here in New Zealand. Okay, and number 2, Christmas crackers. I just had one for the first time last year. I had been here for 4 years. People talked about Christmas crackers. I thought it was a food, didn't realize it was this popping thing with a weird hat and a prize inside. But now I know, and this is not something that I've ever seen in the US, but it's very common here in New Zealand. And last but not least, of course, is the Kiwi Pavlova, a very common summer dessert here in New Zealand. That is a Kiwi recipe, and it's fantastic. And anytime I have Americans come, I always make this for them. It's one of the most fantastic desserts that you guys have created. Such a good question. Odd things you have to get used to coming to New Zealand from the US. Number 1, I'm going to have to say tea time. Yes, morning tea, afternoon tea, dinner being called tea, that's a huge adjustment. We do not have that in the US. The second thing, I'm going to have to say coffee mug size. This is my coffee mug from the US. This is the one that I use daily here in New Zealand. And yeah, you'd have a couple of these and only one of these, so that's an adjustment. And the last one, I'm going to have to say, there's a couple I could have picked from, but the third biggest difference that was hard to get used to was that your stores all close at 5:30 or 6 every night except for Thursday. Yes, that's an adjustment. We are used to everything being open whenever we want in the US. And so that is a huge adjustment moving here to New Zealand. Walking through the bush as an American is so amazing the first time. It's like walking through Jurassic Park or some sort of awesome sci-fi movie. It just looks so green and dense and so different. And the sounds of the birds is so amazing. Walking through the bush is one of my favorite features of New Zealand. I had never tried until I moved to New Zealand and are just not commonplace in the US. Here we go. Okay, number 1 is passion fruit. I had never heard of it, tried it, had it as a flavor in anything until I moved to New Zealand. Now it's great. Number 2, meat pies and sausage rolls. Does not exist in the US, at least from any place I've ever been. And the first time I ever tried it was here in New Zealand. It took me a couple of years to get used to, but now I love them. Okay, number 3, feijoa fruit. I have never heard of it, tried it. I don't even think it exists in the US. I think it's in South America and Russia is the only other places. But you know, it's my favorite. Okay, and number 4, Indian food. Now, it's not that you can't get Indian food in the US, but it is not common like it is here. It is not your common takeaway. Chinese is a common takeaway in the US, or Mexican food, but not Indian. Now I love Indian curries. And number 5, pork belly with crackling. Never heard of crackling, never tried pork belly. Streets in New Zealand, you'll see herds of kids all dressed the same in school uniforms, and you don't really see that in the US, and you certainly don't see it as formally dressed in the US if they do have school uniforms. You'll also see students scootering to school, riding their bikes to school. You also don't see that in the US because honestly, it's not really safe enough to do so. Love it here. 3 party foods that you have in New Zealand that we definitely don't have in the States. First one, fairy bread. Never had that till I came to New Zealand. White bread, butter, and some sprinkles. Pretty good, actually. And number 2, Cheerios. These are like really red colored sausages. I could barely get myself to try one because the color is just so red. Why are they called Cheerios? And number 3, lolly cake. A very sweet cake. I think Americans would probably like it, but I'm honestly not a big fan. My kids love it though. Okay, 3 common New Zealand baking items that are not common in the US or in fact don't exist at all. You may be surprised by number 3. Number 1, castor sugar. Now, it doesn't really exist in the US. You can find it, but it is not common like it is in New Zealand. And basically, it's just finer sugar. And if you are baking with an American recipe, I'm going to tell you that castor sugar works way better than just plain white sugar. And number 2, high-grade flour. The most common flour used in the US is all-purpose flour, but high-grade flour would be more similar to the bread flour in the US because high-grade flour is just high-gluten flour. And number 3, golden syrup. Yes, this does not exist in the US. They have plenty of corn syrup, but no golden syrup. So if you have a New Zealand recipe that you're baking in the US, you're going to have to use maple syrup.